and welcome to My Security TV and our Tech and Sec Weekly. My name is Chris Cubbage. I'm the editor with My Security Media, and today we're joined by a long-time colleague, Jacinta Carroll. She's going to be a guest speaker at the Security Exhibition and Conference here in Sydney on the 17th to the 19th of August, just a couple of weeks away. Security outlook, what it means for Australian organisations. We have no agenda with Jacinta today, so we're going to cover a broad set of areas in relation to the security environment, and there is a lot happening. So without further ado, Jacinta Carroll, great to have you back. Thanks for joining us.
Wonderful to be with you, Chris.
Great. Jacinta, I think the last time we actually had you on was our podcast, just as the pandemic was unfolding in sort of around May, I think 2020. And here we are, we've got Pelosi in Taiwan. The head of Al-Qaeda has just been assassinated by a drone by the US in Afghanistan. And we're still coming out and sort of grasping with biological issues in terms of a pandemic and a range of others that are coming through. So the security environment is, unbelievable at the moment. So I don't even know where you want to start and how you're keeping up. What is on your radar, I suppose, when you think about sort of the security outlook and what your key sort of thoughts are for 2022?
Well, thanks, Chris. Look, you're right to say we're living in an extraordinarily complex time and a very, very difficult time in terms of security. And when you ask how I keep up and what's on my radar, I think it's the question that all our security practitioners out there are asking themselves every day, because there is a great responsibility on the shoulders of everyone in the security industry to be across these things, to understand what's going on. What's on my radar? Look, a few years ago, as someone who's focused deeply and for a long time on terrorism and countering terrorism, it was fairly easy to focus primarily on terrorist actors, other asymmetric actors, cyber actors, and so on. And while states were there, they were mostly in the background and using these as proxies. We had a fairly stable, not great, but not hot interstate security environment. So now, while, as you say, I've been focused on the death or the assassination of the head of Al-Qaeda, someone who's been driving the modern terrorist landscape for more than 20 years, finally killed when we know that he was able to comfortably live in Kabul, in the capital of Afghanistan, which means that Al-Qaeda is alive and well and using it once again as a safe haven. So we have that going on at the same time as a major war in Europe. And I think for me, that's bookcasing from a security environment, the challenges that we have to look at. The asymmetric environment is alive and well. We don't have the high point focus that we had with the so-called Islamic State's caliphate in Iraq and Syria. They were soundly defeated territorially and militarily, but they have dispersed, of course, and they're agile as terrorist groups are. So they're bubbling away, seeking to regroup, and very focused in the disturbing, not just security-related effects of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So between those, what we have is an environment where security isn't just something that sits for interest in the world section of your podcasts, your online news, or the newspaper. It's something that's driving the global economy at the moment. We have countries in recession, a global food crisis because of security issues. As you say, Speaker Pelosi visiting Taiwan, as is her right, as the leader of part of the executive of a liberal democracy. She can travel where she wishes and not go somewhere because another country has decided that they don't like it. A lot of things going on at the moment. I suppose the thing that really interests me as we're coming into the conference is to focus for all of us. How do we and how do our security practitioners across agencies and across organisations keep across that in an effective way? And then how do we translate what that means, if anything, for the Australian environment, for our region, and for the organisations that we work with? And I think there's that perennial chestnut, Chris, of once we've done all that great security magic, how do we persuade those elsewhere in our organisations who are the main decision makers to understand the relevance and the significance and translate that into action with our agencies? So
And it is
really
really
focus.
about, and yeah, sorry to interrupt. It really, because that was going to be my question, is how does the security practitioner sort of communicate to the board and executive and maintain a business driver? As you say, a lot of issues in relation to the economy and security is often influencing the economy now, particularly around prices, inflation and fuel, and you mentioned food. So security has to almost step up. Do you see, not to be fear-mongering, but to be enablers now? We use that term in a lot of cybersecurity, but physical security now needs to be a business enabler.
Absolutely spot on, Chris. How do we not fearmonger but educate? So I think it's a time for those in the security environment to be stepping up, to be leaning in, if you like, to be the go-to to explain what's going on or to facilitate connections into those other sources of expertise. It's really too much for our community to have to stay across everything. But one of the great things about your work with My Security TV and others with the ASIL conference is that we make those connections between those across our communities and make sure that we know where can we go to for that good, digestible, relevant advice. So really being aware of the environment and the network and those who are part of our community and a reference point to bring in that information and make it again, digestible. What does that mean for a board, for others? Well, we know that it's one page or less. It's a few dot points on a PowerPoint slide, and it has to tell a story. We need to be able to not just say, isn't it interesting that Speaker Pelosi has chosen to travel to Taiwan and the Chinese government has threatened, quote, forcible response. We need to tell a story of what that means and why it's relevant to Australia. And one way of doing that, I think, is pick up those stories that we are familiar with. One thing that struck me in preparing for the conference is that we went back to January this year and had a little window into the boardrooms of the top 1,000 companies globally that have some kind of footprint in Russia. I'm pretty sure that none of them would have been thinking, how do I close all of my operations because of global sanctions over the next few months? But that's what they had to do. And This is unprecedented. So there's a story in being aware that you need to be across what's going on, understand your governance. And one thing that's always useful, as we were discussing earlier in the defence game, in the national security business in government, is why don't we just war game that? Why don't we do some scenarios? What if, for example, the Chinese government decided that it would take some kind of coercive action in relation to Taiwan, in relation to the South China Sea? Well, what would that mean for trade? If there were some sanctions imposed, well, what kind of sanctions have we seen with Ukraine? What might out into what Australia might need to do in relation to certain sectors, in relation to China or other players? So breaking it down into some manageable chunks, just to get ourselves thinking about what would it be like if we were there, if we were in that position.
I take it supply chains is key. It should force the business to look inwards and to understand its supply chains in order to address that scenario, because it's not just a matter of what if sort of a war erupts or blockades start happening in the South China Sea. It's understanding, if it does happen, how is it going to affect that business, and understanding the supply chain. So the supply chains are also complex. When you do war game that, do you look at it from the business perspective, or do you look at what advice would you give, or considerations would you have when you're looking at your supply chain in sort of these geopolitical issues and sort of broader supply issues?
Look, great question. This is hard. The first thing I'd say is know your ecosystem. Just as we, with a business head, would look at that supply chain to understand where we might be carrying risk from a normal business perspective, dive down to understand what that supply chain looks like in terms of risk from other areas. And we've had to accommodate some different demands on business these days. The ethical supply chain being probably the dominant one, the one that is understands climate. And in Australia, of course, we've had this with the soft introduction of responsible actions in relation to modern slavery, which has really required all big businesses to know where we sit within that supply chain. And look, there's security reasons might be one kind of push, but if businesses think about understanding supply chain from a bigger perspective, understand what our market is looking for. And modern slavery and climate are a really good lens to put on that. Once you understand your supply chain ecosystem you live in, it will benefit the business overall. From a security perspective, we're just one input to that. And that's probably a way to more helpfully meld this pressure, this factor into normal business.
And one area I wanted to cover off was technology and the outlook for technology in a security sense. We've had a lot of discussion here recently around the use of facial recognition technology. We're moving into a period of advanced video analytics and the like, and we've been running some sessions on that. And we're going to be looking at that at the conference as well. Your thoughts on security-related technology or implications of technology on the security environment and some of the key standouts for you?
Look, massive topic, of course, and we can address it at any level. So I suppose the standout for me, Chris, is beware the propensity for a techno solution. There are many who are kind of trusting that there's something in the magic black box that will fix everything, and it won't. At the conference and on your show, hear from the experts, because they will explain that AI isn't something magic that's just going to Harry Potterize the world for us. It is machine learning. It relies very much on the inputs that we put in, and it's optimized for certain roles and not for others. And then, of course, we get into the ethical area, which is important for all of us because that tends to inform our legislation. So the regulatory environment that we're working in. And that's the balance. While a techno solution might look like it's really neat and it solves everything, is it really the kind of society that we want to live in? And is it really something that would rest easily and well in an environment where we're worried about privacy concerns? So look at, and there's always great examples happening around the world, many of them initiated in Australia because we've got such a vibrant community and such a vibrant civil society. Really interesting developments in the European Union, looking at laws around, in this case, it's come from CASM, child sexual abuse material. But there are some moves to have very invasive technology providing a techno solution to use. Again, a bit of solutioneering. I would say that there's a lot in all of that, but some of the key things that are being discussed in that CSAM environment are how can we make sure that iPhones and Android devices can see what's in an image and stop a child engaging with someone they shouldn't appropriately. Well, that's got a whole bunch of privacy implications and a lot of practical implications as well. But maybe that's not the solution. So I say, don't go techo solution. Maybe there's some other things that we can do in understanding how harms occur. Again, in the debate in Europe, the discussion is, what are we trying to solve here? Is this actually the best way to solve a crime that mostly happens in the physical environment surrounding a child rather than on a phone? So again, looking at that relationship with law, and from the jobs that I've done where I've been involved in tech, the biggest lesson I learned is that everybody talks about tech, very few people understand how it works. Yeah. So for those of us, again, in the security sector, it's very important that we understand how this works, that we're engaged with those who are practically involved in the delivery as well as the research and development, and that we can explain in a realistic way, not a Harry Potter way, how this might work, what the benefits are, as well as the risks in our organisations, and very importantly, what might it mean when it comes to regulation? And is this actually good for business? Is it good for security ultimately? Is it the best way of doing it? And is it something that really reflects the kind of society we want to be in? So big issue, but there are some points on it.
Well, you touched on regulation. There's another area I wouldn't mind covering, and there's a lot of reviews and regulatory changes underway. We've had the Critical Infrastructure Protection Act sort of updated, and we're coming out of grace periods for reporting by critical infrastructure operators. There's a review of the Privacy Act, and you mentioned privacy there. And there's also reviews of electronic surveillance legislation as well, and trying to unpack 20 years of changes across all of that, and looking at AI and quantum within those discussion papers. Again, from a regulatory outlook in relation to the security implications of that, anything that stands out? You mentioned European. Do you think enough is happening in Australia, or some of the leading areas that you might consider within the regulatory environment?
Yeah, look, there's a lot of really good work that's going on. And one thing that my eyes have been open to in the years that I've been working in the think tank and consulting is just how accessible the reviews and regulatory process is in most cases. So there are public submissions, there are parliamentary reviews at federal level as well as state and territory level of these kinds of things, because our legislators know that they're probably not the only people who are interested in it or have the best knowledge. In the European example I used, I mean, one of the reasons that it interests me, and it's attracting quite a lot of it, is that it seems to be something that was solutioneered within the legislative bubble, not in partnership with business. So when we look at electronic surveillance technology, the critical infrastructure protection one is a key one. We need to be looking at that as an industry and say, well, we work in this practically day to day. What really is our country trying to achieve with this? And is this the best way to do it? How's it been working? That's the way you get really good legislation. And the opportunity is there for all of us if we want to exercise our voice. So I would say engage with this. I know we all have very busy jobs. We have the business that we're trying to do, but sit up and above to look at our industry as a whole and say, well, there are some things that will have a very big impact on it. I am a voice. I'm a knowledgeable voice. What contribution could I make to it? I think in Australia we've got some really good examples of that in the tech space in particular. The work that we've done on how we deal with encrypted communications being used for criminal purposes, for example, how we deal with the internet being used for propagandizing and other criminal activity, partly because the big tech companies aren't headquartered in Australia. So we've had to approach it from a position of negotiation. And that's actually been quite powerful. In encrypted communications and surveillance, not saying we need the golden key, we need to be able to unlock this fabulous technology that our economies actually rely upon. Why would we let the genie out of the bottle? How about we work in partnership and say, again, it's not about necessarily unlocking the encrypted comms. Maybe there's some different ways we can approach this. There's a lot going on, and this is one of the problems, I think, in Australia, and we have an opportunity with the new government to review how much legislation, how much regulation there is. Is it consistent across sectors? Is it consistent across the various agencies that are involved in it? And how can we make sure that we're standardizing that as much as possible, but also reducing the overhead for business so that we all take it seriously? We provide the data that's really necessary and it can be used. So having reviews is always a healthy thing. We'll never have an environment, and that's okay, because it means we're trying to keep up with what's happening now and what's emerging. But my big message is get engaged.
And I suppose the last one on that, given that you're speaking at the ASIAL conference, and I think the last time we spoke was with Professor John Blaxland as well, on national resilience planning, and ASIAL's put forward a sort of a draft legislation for national security licensing. We have the federation sort of headache that we have. What's your general view on national security sort of plans and direction, given what we learnt out of the pandemic as well? Does Australia need a new national security plan or strategy, and then how that might impact on the Australian security industry?
Well, great question. Again, very, very big. It never hurts to bring everyone together to strategize and identify what we're trying to achieve, and then see what we have in common. We did that over a very long time with all the states and territories and the federal and the national government in looking at how we deal with counterterrorism from every angle. Legislation, prevention, resilience, response, and so on. And it worked really well. The initial phase, the important one, is to recognise and understand what is it that we're actually talking about, to get us on the same sheet of paper. National security means a lot of things to a lot of people. We've been down this road many times in Australia of reviewing, do we need one agency that does everything? Do we need a national security white paper? We've had something like that a few times. Do we need national security statements? Is it human security, or is it just hard security? We do need to have some way of bringing everyone together. For a long time, national security has been seen as something that is the problem of government. What we know and we see every day, and our industry and this conference is the living, breathing manifestation of it, is that security is something that exists and is practically carried out across society, and business plays a very, very big part in that. So we do need to have a professionalised and to some extent standardised grouping. I think that it's something that what this looks like, all the pieces of it, is something that comes out of negotiation, discussion, and collaboration. It's never helpful to be required to just get up to a standard that's been dictated. Our industry has learnt a lot since the growth in private security providers, and of course they're operating at various different levels. There's a lot of responsibility on private security providers. We've seen in Australia and around the world that quite often this really is our first line of defence. Other people who are responding to and preparing for all sorts of physical, cyber, and other types of security attacks or intrusions, engagements. So we need to make sure that that industry is as well prepared as it can be, and have the relationships that it needs to get good information and relevant information. One thing that surprises me, having come from the federal government, is that even within government, we found it so difficult to communicate on the same systems between federal, state, and territory. There's some pretty basic stuff that we can get in place to just make sure we're using similar camera technology, similar protected communication systems, and have good open references and staged into more controlled references for good standardized information. A great example is the ACSC on cyber, having an outwards focused cybersecurity centre that's engaged deeply with the sector and is providing information at various levels, from public through to most trusted. And that's a really good model. We have the same in terms of our National Counterterrorism Centre, our National Threat Assessment Centre, in providing threat advice on counterterrorism and others. These are really good models because they engage with the everyday work of security practitioners in the private sector through to the public sector. Making those linkages right is the first thing. Then we can move to ensuring we've got a shared framework, a shared understanding, and we can start prioritising some key activities. What matters to all of us in providing security for Australia in the most complex, challenging, strategic environment we have seen since the Second World War.
Well said. And I think there's some real messages there for the industry as well as government on how they can collaborate and communicate. So thank you, Jacinta. You're going to be speaking on Wednesday, the 17th of August. You've got the 10 o'clock slot there, the Global Security Outlook, what it means for Australian organisations. It's great to catch up with you again. Jacinta Carroll, you're now a research fellow with Deakin University, but you're obviously very well known in the industry and quite a leader in your own right. So looking forward to seeing you on Wednesday, the 17th at the ASIAL conference.
Great. Looking forward to seeing you there, Chris, and everyone else.
Wonderful. Thanks, Jacinta. Thank you very much. Thank you for joining us on My Security TV.